These are called red wigglers, and debris in there. Let's find a worm who wants to have a cameo here. Yeah, so red wigglers are what we prefer for food waste composting. They're not native here. The worms that you would see if we ever had rain and worms came up, those are called ground worms, and they love to digest high carbon material like fallen leaves and sticks, right? Because that's what ends up being in the ground. Ground worms are great and beneficial in so many ways, but they don't love human food waste. The benefit of red wigglers is that for the most part, they like eating the same stuff we do. So we purchase the red wiggler worms, and we sell them too. But you can, you can get them here. You can get them at Payne's Nursery in town. You can order them online from a place called Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. Uncle Jim is probably also on Amazon. And then it's really funny to get like a box of worms in the mail. It's very like, oh.
How was your journey?
Exactly. Exactly. And as Trevor, mentioned, worm composting is very different than aerobic composting. Worms are much more like humans. So 130 degrees is not their environment. They like it to be more around, much like us, more around 70 degrees, more around 50% humidity. They will tolerate 90, 100 degrees like we tolerate it in the summer, and tolerate down to pretty cold. We do put a nice thick insulation layer for them, because if there was a long and deep freeze, they could die. But we're looking at different goals when we do aerated static pile versus worm composting. There, our goal is really to transform a huge amount of food waste into a compost. And I kind of consider that compost, in terms of an analogy for your garden, it's like your 3 square meals a day for your healthy diet. Like, that's good. This is slower process. It's obviously much lower volume. This isn't, I kind of call this like, it's adult science fair scale. It's big, it's bigger than a home pile, but it's not exactly like commercial scale system. We still do, most of what we're doing in here is by hand. What we do here also is we compost things first out there because of the pathogens and weed seeds that Trevor mentioned. We make sure, since we're getting volumes of food waste from public places, that it gets treated at that level. And then we're bringing that in as bedding and feeding them different meals, like cornmeal, or Trevor's done experiments with things like kelp meal or this or that, to see what they do and what they like. And basically these little wormies just hang out for several months and eat and poop and eat and poop. And what we're trying to do here is kind of make like that ultimate multivitamin, where it's a really dense soil food, more like an organic Miracle-Gro almost, where a couple tablespoons in your watering can or around the base of your plant and watered in is more what the worm compost is used for. Straw is great because it's high in carbon. It's also a great insulator, so you're making more of a temperature controlled zone for your worms, both for heat and for cool. So we recommend 6, 2 on one side. We make kind of a tight corner here so that, instead of having it pulled out where things could escape, it makes a nice corner. 2 and 1, obviously. Here we have a million gophers, so we put hardware cloth down on the bottom. You can see that here, right? You can get that in a ½ an inch or whatever, but you also might not need to. We've done this, other times in other places.
How big a screen? What's the biggest you can put without them gopher getting in or something?
That's a good question. We use this ½ inch stuff or quarter inch. I'm sorry. We find that chicken wire doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Stuff gets in through chicken wire, and so we go for a hardware cloth. But every place is different, and it's funny because like maybe if I set this up 100 feet that way, maybe gophers wouldn't. It's like it can be that specific. So this is kind of the structure, and obviously it's in transition. But I wanted to leave this and kind of show you when you're starting. It's nice to so maybe you do the hardware cloth, and then you're going to put down a layer of bedding. And like here I have this last disintegrating straw bale. that I'm going to use for my bedding. And you wouldn't have to use this much, but it's good to put a couple of inches of something down and get it nice and moist. And look, this is like what's been hanging out under here. You know, like the straw itself is composting. That's the other great thing about a straw bale composter, is that it will degrade over time and turn into something also like delicious for your soil. So I'm just going to kind of move this in as bedding, and then put one of my nice fresh straw bales in as a border. You can see we've got cardboard in here. Sometimes we use that as an insulator on top over the winter. It was asked by the group I was with if cardboard composts. It does. Obviously, if it's got shiny stuff or tape on it, that won't. It'll compost faster if you shred it or tear it up. It's all about surface area. But it, you know, like it's doing its thing. This used to be a big sheet of corrugated cardboard that covered the whole top, and now it's this. So we're making progress. And then I'm just gonna plug this side here with a new one, and let's kind of get it in a little bit better. And then once I've got my bedding, which again, you don't have to use that much at home. You can just, if you're getting 6 straw bales, just take a couple of handfuls and, you know, give yourself an inch or 2 across the bottom. And then you can, this is already feeling pretty moist to me, so I'm not going to add water right now in the interest of time. But adding water is nice. Worms are, if you keep thinking of worms like us, then you kind of can't go wrong. It's like they need moisture, they need air, they need temperatures around 70 degrees are their favorite. But just like us, they'll tolerate winter and they'll tolerate summer.
Quick question, does it matter what you put in there as far as the grass or whatever you can put, as long as it's carbon stuff?
Exactly, it doesn't matter much. Yep. Okay. Obviously, thinner stuff breaks down faster.
Right, okay.
And so, you know, if it's if you're trimming trees and have a bunch of branches, that's fine, and it'll compost eventually, but much slower than if it's grass clippings or cottonwood leaves or whatever you have. And then I'm going to add my food waste, and this is my food waste. I also, one thing that you might be like, why is that in there? This is parchment paper, which is also certified compostable. Like, you know, if it's a plain paper product, it can compost. If it's got chemicals, you know, wax paper, you wouldn't do. Tinfoil,
like
you wouldn't do.
Paper towels and napkins are okay?
Yep, we do. With worms, and this is for the group that hasn't come to see the aerated static pile yet. They're pretty different. The worms and the home scale are more picky. And so with worms, it's like, I think, really important to think about it as a spectrum. Like, paper towels aren't delicious, but if it's one paper towel every now and again, and it, you know, and you're like cleaning up food with it, it'll break down, it'll compost. If the worms aren't getting it, microbes eventually will. But if for some reason you have 37 paper, you know, if this bin was all filled with paper towels, it's like, that's going to take a long time.
Can you also throw meat and stuff in there, like the other side?
Good question. I don't recommend that. I don't, for here, over there we'll talk about how everything that used to be alive can turn back into soil. Here and in your home scale, you don't want to be attracting any critters. And meat and dairy break down really slowly and tend to smell funky in the process. And so we don't recommend meat or dairy at home. The other things that worms don't love are citrus peels. Avocado shells take forever to break down, and onions aren't a favorite. But again, I kind of put these things on a spectrum. For me, it's more important when I'm cleaning the kitchen to be able to scoop it all in the bin. Maybe if I'm making French onion soup for 50 people, I might do something different with that cleanup, but I've never done that, so I don't foresee myself needing to.
How about eggshells?
Eggshells I put in. What's funny about, yeah, they're right here, and I put them in because I'm lazy. A lot of things are, that's my reasoning for a lot of things. It's efficient. Eggshells are basically already calcium carbonate, and so they don't change. They'll just break down into smaller pieces and go back into your soil as calcium carbonate. Some people who are less lazy than me will like dry their eggshells separately, maybe in the oven, or keep them, you know, just keep them in a separate container. And then I've had people tell me they blend them in a food processor or blender into a powder, and use that as a specific plant food. Again, I'm kind of lazy, so I just throw them in here. And actually, worms are, you know, they're kind of ground dwellers, right? They're shy. They like to be inside of things. So often I'll reach in and find like half an eggshell with 20 worms snuggled in it, you know. Same is true for pumpkins or watermelon rinds. They go nuts for watermelon rinds. You know, those kinds of different textures and environments for them. So I'm just gonna throw this stuff in there. And again, right, like usually we put this bin down in there, so I've got things that I might not always give my worms, but I'm not worried because it's not that much. A couple of paper towels, a mandarin, etc. And then we're not gonna leave it just like this, right? So you add your food waste and then you cover it up. And since I have so much bedding, I'm just pulling that. If you were using less, we often recommend a layer of bedding and then approximately 1-to-1 of food waste and something carbon. So if you're setting this up at home, you can either be pulling handfuls out of these straw bales, or some people get like a 7th straw bale to pull from if they don't have, depending on where you live in New Mexico, you might not have any carbon material. You know, like you might be surrounded by trees, or you might have nothing but juniper and pinon, depending on where you live. And so that's where straw bales can be nice. Office paper, cardboard, especially if you're able to shred it up a little bit, that can be great. Some types of egg cartons are just plain compressed cardboard, which again, it takes some time, but all of these things can be added. And so approximately whatever volume of food waste you're adding, and then an equal volume of that. And then once I filled this whole layer, so maybe in a week or two, then I might add another layer of straw or carbon bulking material. So I don't need to do it every time, but making sure that I have a lot of carbon and bulking material basically prevents any problems that you might be worried about. It prevents odors, it prevents pests, it keeps the pile like active and aerated, and it also retains moisture for the worms, which is really important here.
You gotta keep watering it every so often?
What I usually do, and again, I have this liner in it, which I'm gonna put down in our commercial system, because even though it's certified compostable, worms are like cold, we call it cold composting, even though it's, you know, ambient temperatures. And this stuff only breaks down at higher temperatures. Typically, I would empty it, and then I'd go up to that spigot, fill this bucket with water, swish it around, and add that amount of water. The food waste itself, most of the foods we're dumping in are like 90 or higher % water. If it's, you know, any vegetable material is like 95% water. So it ends up having moisture from that as well. And I find that if I rinse whatever bucket or container I'm using, that's kind of my like volume measures, like 1 bucket of food waste, 1 bucket of water, and 1, you know, more or less bucket size of leaves, straw, whatever I've got. And then yeah, every I'll sort of, you know, so I added here today, I'll add food waste here. I mean, I won't have this much food waste tomorrow, but you know, in 5 or 6 days when I do, I'll add it here and I'll rotate around. And then once I get around, I'll be like, okay, let's put another thicker bulking layer on top. And then, especially in the summer, or if you're noticing that it's really getting dry, you can put a nice thick layer on top and just leave it there, and then be kind of like lifting and adding as another technique that a lot of people like. Once I'm ready to harvest this, first of all, how do I know? This is slow composting compared to high heat commercial scale. This, in a warm season like March through October, 3 to 6 months, depending on where you live and how much food you're adding. You know, checking in 3 months is a good.
When do the worms get added to that?
Thank you. There are already worms in here, so I really appreciate that question. If I'm setting it up, I would add the bedding, the food waste, and the worms, and then cover.
Gotcha.
Yep, thank you.
Now, when you say cover, you're talking about this
I'm
kind of
talking
cover?
Yep, I'm talking about this.
So,
I'm just talking about making sure that there's not, you know, raw food waste that my dogs are going to come eat instantly.
So you get the crows and stuff like that come in. Do you want to throw a tarp on it or something, or would that get too hot and kill the worms?
In the winter, a tarp can be great. but in the summer, you're right, it can get a little hot. So we recommend if you can do some kind of carbon layer or even the cardboard. And if you're worried about heat, you can get the cardboard wet and just make sure you're
I'm
getting
worried
good.
about the birds coming in and picking up
a big flattened cardboard box could be great in terms of simple things you can reuse. I've seen people they had an old scrap of carpet, so they whatever you've got, finding something to upcycle is always preferred.
So they will live through the summer here?
They'll live through the summer here. The bigger challenge is the winter. And so in the winter we do often add, either like another 6 inches of straw or a tarp or a carpet or I've seen somebody put like an old screen door they had on hand on top to try to get more solar. They often survive, and that's the insulating factor of the straw bales is really beneficial for that. And they will kind of self-regulate. They won't be very active. They'll find one little warm corner down there to huddle in. So from October to March, you're probably not harvesting any compost because those worms aren't very busy and active.
Can you still put in there?
You can still, you can still put in there if you want. It's just that matter of knowing of like, okay, well this is going to more or less sit here until the worms get busier again. So yeah, you can definitely still add and just keep it covered.
How many worms do you put in for this amount?
I put in two little handfuls, because they'll just keep making worm babies. It's fine.
So when you go to buy them online, they'll sell a 300 or 1,000 or...
Totally. Get the smallest amount you can.
Okay.
Yep. And yeah, when we sell them here, we put them in a to-go cup, It's like, okay, here.
How long would they keep in there?
They'll, you don't want, if they're going to be in your hot car, they will,
No, I'm saying we're going to travel back to, let's say, Edgewood.
That's fine. They'll be fine in there.
And then when you get home, you put them in keep until you start doing this?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, put them in the
Have you found that over the winter they will all die?
It has happened. And so that's kind of your worst case scenario, is that they'll all die. These didn't. And they just had a straw and cardboard cover. These made it this winter. It was a pretty mild winter though. The worst case scenario is that they die and they're adding to your compost in another way now. and then in the spring, the replenishing them will kind of activate that process.
In systems
again.
I've seen that are layered, they will keep moving following the food. So how do you separate that from whatever you want to yield?
Yep, very good question. So I kind of go in a little clockwise feeding pattern. When I'm getting to that 3-month mark and I'm or I have a garden project or whatever my motivation is that I know I'm going to want to try to get compost, is I'll feed in just one corner.
Gotcha.
And that will naturally draw the worms there because that's where the good fresh food is. And then after a week or two of doing that, I harvest from everywhere else. And I tend to just kind of pull back. First of all, I'm not very picky about my aesthetics, so I don't mind if there are things like straw or bigger wood chips or whatever in my soil. I just kind of pull back, the thicker bulking layers and scoop what is down there into the wheelbarrow. Some folks will take that same hardware cloth that we've got on the bottom here for gophers and build a simple frame with 2x4s so that it's tight, like a grown-up sandbox sifter, and set it over their wheelbarrow and scoop from the pile onto that and kind of sift it through if you're looking for a more fine or refined worm compost product. And then that product is really premium. It's
Black gold.
Black gold, exactly, right? It's worm castings is the fancy name for worm.
You don't ever stir it up, right?
I don't, and that's why I add all of that extra bulking material, so I don't have to. Okay. If you don't have that material, or if you do notice this is getting a little smelly or something doesn't seem quite right, the solution is almost always fluff it up, give it a light little lift with a pitchfork, and here making sure that it's moist enough. We say the moisture should be about 50%, and the kind of analogies for that are coffee grounds that you've just brewed, right? So there's they cling together, but they're not dripping, right? Or a sponge that's been wrung out.
Is it okay to put coffee grounds in that stuff?
It is. Yep, coffee grounds are great.
What about ashes?
Ashes in moderation. ashes, I mean, the worms won't love them, but they can, you know, it's fine. We don't have to cater everything. You know, but the thing with wood ash is that it's super duper alkaline. And so actually some people use it, save it, and use it as weed suppressant. So you just want to make sure most soils, we want kind of a neutral pH. And so if you're adding a lot of wood ash, the chances of becoming far too alkaline are there. And so, and the same, you know, with the compost and the worms. So it's like if you do the occasional fire, yeah, no problem. But if it's just good to be mindful that it can become too much.
So this is not the same as, because we have some of those little big barrels that they use with the churn. This is not that at all.
This is not that. That is all about aeration. So over
Like
there we're
that.
talking about aerated static. Those are about aerated dynamic, right? They're moving. And those are great. I typically recommend those more for wetter places than here. Compost systems are kind of a balance of moisture retention and aeration. And because we live in such a dry place, here we're always looking for that moisture retention side. Anything that's moving a lot and having a lot of air, it just dries out faster.
In those, can you use all of your kitchen scraps, like your meat, your dairy, your citrus?
We still wouldn't do meat or dairy in those.
Oh, you wouldn't?
Yeah.
But there's air going through them though.
What's that?
Doesn't it do the same as that? Because
It's hard because those are so small. It's hard to get those to a high enough temperature, and so you'd have to be really like, you know, turning it a dozen times a day or something to try to get that much activity. So we still wouldn't recommend meat or dairy in those just for smells and funk potential. But you know, but they work. Some people swear by them. It's just a matter of making sure that you're keeping it moist enough for the microbes to stay alive, because they dry out quicker.
And you don't put worms in those?
And you don't put worms in those, because there you're going for heat, and the worms like it more in this kind of 70-degree-ish range.
That explains it.
It's a really common right? It's like there's all these ways to compost, and it's a really common like misconception to kind of layer them. It's like, hey, put the worms in the thing, and you know, and it's like, yeah, worst case scenario, you've got, you know, dead worms are good for your soil too.